I kept standing there with the cold airport light burning into my eyes, as if the whole place wanted to make sure I saw everything collapsing without missing a single detail. And I could feel the last scraps of warmth sliding out of me when the woman I had shared most of my life with walked away with. Her shoulders lifted like someone finally dropping a burden she had rehearsed, hating for years, and I kept waiting for her to turn back, but she never did, and the storm warnings echoed over the speakers, like the sky itself was shutting the doors on me, and I could not shake the sting of how fast she said she was finished with me. How simple it was for her to say she wanted luxury and a different life, as if all the years we had built together were a mistake she had patiently tolerated, and the sting of her sibling recording my humiliation made the whole thing feel unreal. Like a stage built just to show the world that I had failed, and I did not know where to put my hands or my breath or my voice as she boarded that flight. That never ended up leaving while I stood there with nothing in my pockets and nothing behind my ribs except a tight, shaking fear and a kind of shame that made my throat hurt. And when I realized my wallet was gone too, it felt like some invisible hand had decided I was supposed to lose everything in the same hour, and the lights flickered above the empty chairs while the last few people rushed to shelters, and I sat with my head down trying to pretend I was not sinking, and the music somewhere far off kept repeating, a Christmas melody meant for joy, but here it sounded like someone whispering reminders that everyone else had somewhere to go, and I had nowhere, and I must have looked broken enough that the older figure in the wheelchair felt compelled to speak to me, and I almost told him to keep going, but something in his voice was steady, gentle, like he had seen too many people crumble to mistake it. And when he asked if I was all right, I answered with a lie, so thin, it almost fell apart before it left my mouth. And somehow, he sensed everything anyway, and the way he looked at me made it impossible not to tell him what had happened, and the words spilled out of me faster than I expected, each one dragging pieces of my pride with it. But he just listened without flinching, without judging, like someone who had lived long enough to know life could cut clean through people and leave them standing. And when he told me he had a house and needed help and offered a place to stay for one night, I thought maybe I was hallucinating from exhaustion, because no one offers kindness like that for nothing, and yet he waited calmly, like he already knew what I would decide. And maybe I said yes, because I did not want to sleep on a cold bench waiting to be forgotten, or maybe because something in me recognized that this stranger was not looking for anything to take from me, and the ride through the storm felt like being carried to another world, completely separate from the ruins of my old life, and the gates, the house, the quiet order of everything inside, made me feel like I had wandered into a place not meant for someone who had just lost everything, and yet they treated me like I belonged there, like I was allowed to breathe again, and I kept wondering when the kindness would turn into something else, because nothing in my life ever stayed good for long. But the night passed, and the food tasted like it had been made for someone who needed warmth, and the room they gave me felt too generous for someone left behind in an airport. And while I lay awake in that enormous bed staring at the ceiling, I could still hear the woman I loved telling me I was not enough, and I did not know how to peel that sentence off my skin. But I also could not deny that something had shifted the moment the older man said I could stay, because for the first time in a long time, I felt like the world had paused instead of pushing me under, and I did not know what the morning would bring, but I knew I was no longer drowning alone, and that frightened me in a way I could not explain, because if kindness could appear this suddenly, then loss could too, and I did not know which one was waiting for me next. I woke to voices drifting up from somewhere below, soft, easy sounds that did not match the chaos still echoing in my chest, and for a few seconds I forgot where I was, until the memory of the house, the quiet generosity, the overwhelming contrast to the airport hit me, and I sat there feeling like someone who had stepped out of a disaster and into a dream that did not quite fit my shape. And when I went downstairs, the older man was already at the table with a cup of coffee, and the driver and the housekeeper were talking to him like people who genuinely enjoyed his company, and the way they greeted me made something twist inside me, because I had not felt welcomed in a long time, and he poured me coffee like we had known each other for years, and told me he had a plan to help me get a new phone and temporary identification, and I tried to protest out of habit because I was not used to anyone fixing anything for me, and he stopped me with a calm look that said refusing help was pointless, and the pancakes tasted like comfort. I did not realize I had been starving for. And the next few days he kept every promise he made with the same quiet sureness that made it impossible not to trust him, and I kept waiting for some hidden motive. But all I found was a man who had been generous so long, he did not know how to be anything else. And when he called me into his study on the third day, I felt a strange pull in my throat because I was beginning to want the safety of this place. And that terrified me more than losing everything at the airport, because wanting anything meant risking the moment it would be taken away. And he told me he had another offer, something deeper, heavier, a life-shifting possibility, and I sat across from him with my hands clasped too tightly as he explained how he needed someone steady, someone willing to be beside him through ordinary days and complicated ones, and how he saw something in me that made him believe I could do the work, and I wanted to refuse, because I thought I was still a man who had a home somewhere else. But the truth was that home was already gone, and the person who used to greet me there had turned into someone who could discard me without hesitation. And when he asked me what I was going back to, the answer sat heavy in the air because I knew it was nothing, nothing worth resisting, nothing worth saving, and he gave me 2 weeks to decide. But I already knew I had stepped into a different path the moment I followed him through the storm, and the 2 weeks dissolved into 2 months without me noticing, because every day carried a sense of purpose I had not felt in years, and the work we did together felt meaningful, and the way he trusted me felt new, raw, and frightening in its gentleness, and I began to realize how lonely I had been long before the airport, how invisible I had become in the life I thought was stable. And one morning, when the housekeeper placed a cup of coffee in front of me with a small smile, I felt something unclench inside me, and I knew that somehow this place had become a space where I could breathe again. And the older man and I built a rhythm to our days, discussing finances, planning charity work, talking late into the evening, while old films played in the background, and sometimes he would say something thoughtful, something unexpectedly sharp, that fortune story, life, made me laugh in a way I had not laughed in years, and I could feel myself being stitched back together slowly, quietly, without ceremony. But then the knock came on, a morning heavy with winter light, and the driver's face was pale enough to make my stomach drop. And when she said the older man wanted us in his study, I knew the calm of the past months was about to crack, and my chest tightened because I had learned to fear quiet changes and subtle shifts since the night I was left behind at the airport. And when we entered the study and saw his expression, furious, controlled, burning from the inside, I felt that old sinking weight return, and he told us everything at once. The phone call, the lawsuit, accusations, and the sudden poisonous intrusion of people who had thrown me away without a thought and now smelled opportunity, and my breath felt stuck as he explained how they had visited, how they had tried to play concern, and how they had dropped the mask the moment I was gone. And I could feel my pulse beating in my throat because I knew them too well, knew their pattern of taking, draining, twisting everything to their advantage, and my instinct was to run, leave, vanish, so I would not drag him into the shadow of the life I had barely escaped. And I said I would go, but he shut it down instantly with a strength that surprised me, and he told me he knew exactly what they were doing. That wealth had taught him to see through the greedy and the desperate, and that he was not going to let me disappear just because they had decided to rewrite the past. And when he said he wanted a family dinner to settle everything, I felt a strange trembling inside me because I had never been defended like that, never been someone worth standing firm for. And as I stood there, staring at the man who had taken to me in on the worst night of my life, I realized that whatever was coming next would not be faced alone, and that truth scared me and steadied me all at once. The day of the dinner felt wrong from the moment I opened my eyes, a strange stillness clinging to the air, like the house itself was bracing for impact, and I kept trying to steady my breathing, because even though months had passed since the airport, I still felt that old familiar dread whenever the past came knocking. And by evening the table was set. The lights warmed the whole place, carrying a quiet tension looping beneath every sound. And when the older man's daughter arrived with her family, the atmosphere shifted just slightly enough to remind me what real affection looked like, and she greeted me with a kindness that made something inside me ache, because it had been so long since anyone met me with simple, uncomplicated warmth, and I thought maybe the night might unfold gently. But then the door opened again, and the two people I least wanted to see in the world stepped in, wearing smiles, stretched thin like plastic, and the moment the woman touched my cheek, as if she had not abandoned me in the front of strangers, I felt the old wound flare sharp and humiliating, and the sibling hovered nearby, filming pieces of the room with that same practiced hunger for attention that had fueled everything months before, and dinner became a slow, suffocating performance, with the woman brushing her hand against mine as if trying to stitch herself back into a life she had thrown away, and the sibling praising things she did not care about, only to capture enough flattering footage to spin a new version of reality for whoever followed her. I kept trying to stay quiet, keep still, keep invisible, because I could feel something building in the older man beside me, a pressure that was pulling tight across the room, and when dessert was placed on the table, he let the silence drag for just long enough that every movement stopped, every breath hovered, and then he spoke with a calm that felt like the edge of a storm, telling them he had made decisions about his will. And I watched the transformation happen. Instantly, the woman straightening the sibling, leaning forward, phones shifting subtly to catch every word, as if the truth itself were content, waiting to be exploited. And when he said his daughter would inherit, as always, their attention flickered only for a moment before snapping back the moment he mentioned the foundation carrying my name and the percentage attached to it, and I felt the woman's grip clamp around my hand. Under the table, a desperate, panicked pressure that made my skin crawl because it was not affection, it was hunger. Fear, calculation wrapped in tenderness, and the sibling's expression froze, then cracked eyes widening, as she tried to swallow her reaction, and the older man continued without pausing, granting me the guest house, praising my work, speaking of me with a sincerity that made my chest feel too tight and too full, and I could sense the shift in the air as the woman began to unravel, her voice trembling, with practiced emotion, insisting she loved me, insisting she had always cared, pretending the airport never happened, but he shut her down with a sharpness I had never heard from him, slicing clean through her performance and exposing every lie she had tried to cloak herself in. And then he turned to the sibling, revealing debts, secrets, motives, everything she had hoped to hide, and I watched her go pale, like her whole world had been dragged into the light and stripped bare, and I could feel myself shrinking from the table, wanting to disappear, wanting none of this, because the chaos of my old life was leaking into the place that had taught me how to breathe again. And then the older man turned to me, offering divorce papers, offering a deed, offering a foundation, offering a future that did not revolve around being stepped on or ignored or drained, and the room felt too small, too bright, too sharp, because in that moment I realized I had a choice, and for the first time in years the choice was mine, untouched, unpressured, unmanipulated. And when I looked at the woman who had thrown me away, the person who had built her happiness on humiliating me, the one who was now crying only because wealth had slipped out of her grasp, I felt something steady settle inside me, a clarity that felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years, and I said the words, signing away everything we had been, and her sobs rose, in the air like cold steam evaporating against a truth she could not twist anymore, and the sibling stopped recording, finally understanding that her usual tricks had no power here, no audience willing to feed on her poison, and the older man finished it all with a final offer, an ultimatum really, the NDA, the service hours, the consequences, and they broke, they crumbled, they folded because without control, without leverage, without money, they had nothing to stand on. And as they left the house, the door closing on them with a heavy thud, I felt a strange mix of loss and relief, choking me at once, because part of my life had just been cut clean away, and yet for the first time it did not hurt the way I expected it to. It felt like release, quiet and final, and terrifying in the best possible way. The days after that dinner blurred together in a way that felt unreal, as if the house itself wanted to rinse away the aftertaste of everything that had happened, and I walked around with a strange weightlessness, like someone who had stepped out of a collapsing building and was still checking his hands for ash. And the older man watched me the way someone watches a person learning to breathe again, giving space but never distance, and I did not know how to process the quiet that followed, because I had spent so long bracing for criticism, bracing for disappointment, bracing for the sharp tones and sharper silences, that the absence of all that felt almost frightening, and the woman and her sibling faded from my days, as if they had been smoke and not people, woven through decades of my life. And yet sometimes, late at night, their voices would creep back, the accusations, the belittling, the way they made me feel small without even trying, and I would have to sit up with the lights off just to remind to myself that none of that had power here. And one morning, while I was sitting in the garden house, the older man rolled toward me with a careful look that always meant he had been thinking deeply before speaking, and he told me his daughter wanted me to meet someone, and something in my chest tightened, not because I was afraid of the meeting, but because the idea of someone imagining a future for me was still new and unsettling, and he said it gently, as if he knew every thought crossing my mind before it formed, and I told him I was not sure I was ready, not sure I had anything left to offer anyone, and he nodded with that patient understanding he carried like a second heartbeat, telling me that readiness was not a requirement for possibility, and the conversation stayed with me for days, tugging at parts of me I did not know how to name, and while the world outside the estate kept moving fast, rushing through seasons and holidays and stories, I watched my own life shifting quietly like snow, drifting across a window, leaving patterns I never expected, and the foundation work deepened, filling my days with purpose and exhaustion and the kind of weight that felt meaningful instead of suffocating. And sometimes the older man and I would spend long evenings going through paperwork or planning fundraisers while the housekeeper moved softly through the halls, humming under her breath, and the driver would stop by the kitchen to tell us small stories from her day, and the whole place felt like a family stitched together from people who had chosen to stay, not people forced by obligation or habit. And the more time passed, the more I realized how much I depended on the rhythm of these days, depended on the older man's steady presence, his thoughtful pauses, the unexpected humor he dropped into conversations, and one afternoon while we were reviewing documents, he looked up at me with an expression that held a quiet sadness layered beneath his usual composure. And he told me he had been feeling tired, in a way his body did not quite shake off, and I tried to hide the way that sentence cut through me with a cold, sharp edge, but he saw it. He always saw more than I said, and he reassured me with the kind of softness that only made the fear worse, because deep down I knew he was preparing me for a truth neither of us wanted to name, and the days that followed felt heavier, not because anything dramatic happened, but because every small gesture carried a meaning I could not ignore. The slow way he moved, the thoughtful way he rested between tasks, the quiet sighs when he thought no one was listening, and I felt myself growing terrified, not of losing him, but of what losing him would unravel inside me, because he had become the anchor, never had the steady point that taught me I was allowed to exist without being diminished. And one morning while we were having coffee, he asked me what I thought of the garden house, if it felt like home to me. And I nearly choked because the question carried a weight he did not elaborate on, and I fumbled for words, trying to explain that home was not something I knew how to identify anymore. And he smiled gently, telling me that sometimes home is simply where someone finally sees you, and I did not know how to answer because no one had ever said something like that to me, and the fear inside me grew with every passing day because I could feel the shift approaching like a storm far off in the place horizon, and I wanted to pretend I did not sense any of it, but even the house felt different, softer, quieter, as if it too was bracing. And one evening, while the sun dipped behind the snow-covered trees, casting long shadows across the room, he reached out and placed his hand over mine with a fragile steadiness and told me that no matter what happened next, I needed to keep living, keep choosing myself, keep building the life that had finally started to bloom around me. And the words struck something deep because I realized he was passing something to me, something more than responsibility, something like a promise or a legacy, shaped not by blood, but by the simple act of choosing someone. And I sat there, holding on to his words like they were the last warm thing in a cold world. And for the first time in years, I felt my throat tighten with a grief that had not fully arrived, but was already shaping itself inside me, quietly, inevitably, and all I could do was sit there hoping the moment would not come too soon, hoping the house would hold together a little longer, hoping the person who saved my life without meaning to would stay just long enough for me to learn how to face the world without him. The morning it happened did not announce itself with anything dramatic, no sudden cold, no strange silence, nothing except a faint heaviness in the air that I tried to ignore as I made my way through the house, and the moment I stepped into his room I felt the world narrow into a single point, because he was there but too still, too quiet, and I knew before I touched him that the thing I had been fearing had already passed through the walls like a shadow that did not need permission, and for a moment I could not move, could not breathe, could not even think, as if everything inside me had been knocked loose and scattered across the floor. And when I finally reached out to shake his shoulder, the truth settled into my bones with a softness that hurt more than any blow, and I stood there, surrounded by the quiet weight of a life that had changed mine without asking for anything in return, and I whispered, "Something I cannot remember now, something small, something broken," and the house seemed to understand, because every sound folded inward as if holding its breath along with me, and I do not know how long I stood there before calling for help, or how the rest of the morning unfolded, because grief has a way of blurring time, pulling it thin, stretching moments, until they all feel the same. But I remember the daughter arriving with tears streaming down her face, and the housekeeper gripping my shoulder like she was holding me up, and the driver standing in the doorway with her hands pressed together, whispering a prayer into her palms, and I remember feeling strangely separate from all of it, like I was watching from a distance, unable to step back into my own body. And when they finally took him away, the emptiness he left behind filled the hallways like a thick fog, and I wandered through the house, touching the backs of chairs, the cold surface of tables, the frame of the doorway where he used to pause, before entering, as if my hands could make sense of a world that had shifted without warning, and the daughter stayed close to me as arrangements were made, as calls were placed, as pieces of a life were gathered and honored. And I kept waiting for the grief to crash through me in one violent wave, but instead it seeped slowly into the cracks until everything inside me felt waterlogged and heavy, and the funeral people spoke of him with reverence, with tenderness, with the kind of admiration that made my chest ache, because each story reminded me how lucky I had been to know him, even for such a short time. And when the daughter hugged me and whispered that he had loved me like a son, something inside me finally buckled, and I had to turn away for a moment just to steady myself, because love was not something I had been given freely in a very long time, and having it placed in my hands now felt overwhelming and unbearably fragile. And after the last of the mourners left, I stood alone by the fresh earth, listening to the wind move through the trees, and I told him quietly that I would not waste what he had given me, and I would not disappear into the version of myself I had been before that night in the airport, and those words felt like a promise, binding and irreversible. And in the weeks that followed, I worked through the foundation tasks he had prepared, sorting documents, crafting plans, meeting people who had admired him from afar, and each task, I felt like another thread tying me to him, threading purpose into the spaces grief had hollowed out, and the garden house became the center of my days, a place that held echoes of his laughter, the memory of our conversations, the steady warmth of everything he had believed in. And sometimes when I sat by the window watching the snow melt into the soil, I felt as if he were still somewhere nearby, watching, quietly making sure I kept going. And the daughter visited, often bringing stories from her family, asking about the projects, asking if I needed anything. And each visit reminded me that the family I gained through him was still here, still choosing me in the same way he had chosen me on that night that shattered everything and rebuilt everything else. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sharp edges of grief began to soften, not because the loss hurt any less, but because the memory of him had begun to take root in me, in a way that felt living and steady. And when I tried to imagine my life without this house, without the people he had gathered around him, I realized that I no longer needed to search for a place to belong, because he had already given me one, not through inheritance or obligation, but through the quiet, unwavering kindness that had saved me long before I understood what was happening. And as I stood in the doorway one evening, looking out at the first hint of spring, I whispered a thank you into the fading light, hoping it would reach wherever he had gone, and I let myself believe that he would have heard it. The first spring without him felt unreal, as if the world had decided to move forward without asking whether I was ready. And every morning I stepped outside the garden house, expecting the quiet weight of his presence to roll toward me. But instead, there was only the soft rustle of new leaves and the faint echo of all the conversations we never finished, and I tried to rebuild my days piece by piece, the way he would have wanted, but grief kept slipping into everything, even the small tasks folding itself into the corners of the foundation. Work, the meetings, the emails, the quiet hours spent staring at documents that once made sense only because he was in the next room ready to offer a thought or a joke or a story from a life lived with more courage than he ever admitted. And sometimes I would catch myself turning to ask him something, forgetting for a heartbeat that the space beside me was empty, and the realization would hit me, again sharp, then dull, then settling into an ache that stayed with me like a second pulse. And the daughter visited, often bringing warmth and noise, and a reminder that the world had not stopped with him, and she asked how I was holding up, and I always said fine because I did not. You know how to explain that grief is not a thing you survive once, but a tide that rises and falls quietly, wearing down the parts of you that once felt certain. And she would squeeze my arm or sit with me in the kitchen, telling me that her father would be proud of what I was doing. And each time she said it, I felt something crack open inside me. Not painful exactly, but tender, the way new skin feels when touched for the first time. And the foundation grew in ways I could not have anticipated. Donors reaching out, researchers sending updates, people speaking his name with gratitude and admiration. And every accomplishment felt like placing another stone in a path he had started long before I ever arrived. And I walked that path because it was the closest thing to talking with him again. And months passed in quiet, steady rhythms, until one day, as autumn brushed the edges of the trees, the daughter told me she wanted to introduce me to someone again. And this time the idea did not strike fear into me. It only tugged at something inside me, like a soft question, asking whether I was still alive, still capable of stepping into a world beyond memory. And I agreed. And when the hospital administrator arrived, smiling with a gentleness that felt familiar, something in me shifted, not in a dramatic lightning bolt way, but in a quiet, almost imperceptible thaw. And we talked not about grief or loss or anything heavy, but about small things. Books, work, her habit of collecting strange ceramic cups, and I found myself laughing unexpectedly at something she said, and the sound startled me because it had been so long since laughter felt natural rather than forced. And the daughter watched from across the room with a knowing look that made me roll my eyes. But I felt something soften anyway, and over the next months, the administrator and I saw each other, slowly, cautiously, without expectation, without pressure. And each time we met, I felt another layer of old fear loosen its grip on me, like I was remembering how to live without bracing for abandonment. And the garden house changed with the seasons growing, warmer, brighter, more lived in, and sometimes at night I would sit, in the quiet, and talk to him, not out loud, but in the way people speak to the ones they have lost when they finally accept the loss as part of themselves. And I would tell him about the foundation, about the administrator, about the ways I was learning to exist without drowning in what might have been. And the strange thing was that it never felt like talking to someone gone. It felt like speaking into a space that still held him gently, firmly, as if he had only stepped into another room for a moment. And the second Christmas without him arrived with a softness that surprised me. The house filled with the daughter and her family, the driver teaching card tricks again, the housekeeper fussing over dishes, refusing help, and the administrator sitting beside me with a shy smile that warmed the cold edges of winter. And when we all raised our glasses, the daughter repeating the words her father used to say, I felt a deep, still, steady peace settle into me, a peace I had not known even before my life had unraveled at that airport. And I realized then that the family I had lost had never truly been mine, but the family I had found, the one built through kindness, through choice, through shared quiet moments, had become something real, something unshakable. And as the lights from the towering tree reflected in the window, I whispered a thank you to the man who saved me simply by offering a place to rest on the night the world collapsed. And I felt a warmth stir in my chest, as if his hand rested on my shoulder one last time, urging me forward into whatever came next. And I knew I was not the same man who had stood abandoned and hollow under the harsh airport lights. I had become someone rebuilt, piece by piece, through compassion and courage, and the quiet, unspoken belief that even after everything had fallen apart, life could still open its door to me again. And I let that truth settle in me fully, gently, permanently, like a final chapter closing without regret.